Africa for having me here to host this workshop, which is one of a series of workshops that's run by Impepho Press. I am Sarah Godsell. I am 1/3 of Impepho Press, and the workshops that are following these on tomorrow and Friday are run by Vangile Gansho and Tanya Pretorius, and we're going to be addressing different aspects of the publishing process. And before I start, I just want to welcome all of you here who are watching on the live streaming, who are watching at home, and I have one participant in the virtual room with me. Hi, Etumuleng. So before I start, I want to just think for a minute about why is it important to publish? You know, we focus a lot on the kind of individual credits that it gives, that like, I have a book, I am an author. And of course, that's great and important because you are valuable and you deserve your flowers. But I think that it's also important to think about the other aspect of what we are putting out into the world. And this is really why Impepho Press came into being. When we think about whose stories are told and whose stories are not told, and how these stories are both told but also held and ushered into the world. We believe in a plethora of stories, that you are important and your story is important. And more than just being important, your story is worth being cared for. And this is really the process that I'm going to talk about today. What is caring for your story, taking it from a manuscript into a book? What does that process look like? What does it feel like? It's a very emotional process, and it's also a very technical process. And it also can be a financially onerous process. And the combination of those things, I think, can be very intimidating when people are thinking about publishing. So the title of this workshop is, so you have a manuscript, now the team. But I also want to just pause on what makes a manuscript. I mean, a manuscript kind of by definition is something that's in a work in process. It's turning into a book. It's not there yet, but this work in process is a really exciting space, actually, because the ideas, the poems, the stories are there and ready to be polished and ready to be excavated and ready to have all the extra things pruned off and ready to be molded into a narrative. So I think that often when we think about publishing, we think like, okay, the manuscript is done and now like push it off my plate and it goes into the publishing. So it goes to the publisher or goes to a printer, or but really your involvement as the creator of these stories, as the person who these stories lives inside, your involvement is going to be from point A to Z. And it's going to be an emotional process all the way through. So how do you know when your manuscript is ready? And this is one of the questions that we get asked quite frequently at Impepho Press, is like, what marks a ready manuscript? And this is a question that you'll ask, that will need to be asked again and again. And it's never going to be ready, because when the manuscript goes into the kind of team process that I'm going to talk about, it's still not a finished, signed off document. But while like that, saying that, it's still really important that you have put in the time and the work into the manuscript before you hand it to other people to do other things, or to do other things with you. So what should you have done to your manuscript, with your manuscript, when you're thinking of getting it ready for publishing? There should have been a long and painful editing process. I'm going to speak about this a bit more now, because editing is just the work that is kind of never done until you get to that point where we're signing off the final documents and it's going to print, and also is, I think, pretty much the most emotional part of it. And a lot of that editing process sits with you, but that doesn't mean that it's not done in community. While you're compiling and thinking about your manuscript, it's important to have maybe friends, maybe people you really don't like, but whose poetry you really respect, but people who can invest time in you, and look at your poetry and not edit it in relation to you, if that makes sense. Because part of this manuscript process is committing to the work, which is the manuscript, and understanding that while the poems or the stories or the novel lives in you and comes from you, once it's in the manuscript, it's a separate piece of work, and it's not going to be governed by what you want it to do. And I think this is one of the hardest processes of the editing aspect. Also, in the kind of process of putting your manuscript together, having people to edit individual poems is really important. And also the editing is you can choose different avenues and they will get you into very different places. Because if you choose avenues of people who just love your work and who aren't critical, and who aren't critically engaged in the form or the structure or the why of the poem or the story of the poem, or what each word in the poem, what work it's doing, then you'll end up with a manuscript that is more about you than it is about the manuscript. The editing process, you need people who can engage you critically, and this might be very painful. I mean, it is almost inevitably very painful. And one of the questions that we also get asked quite a lot is how long does the editing process take? And that completely depends on the manuscript, on the process, on how long you need to sit with some of the edits, how long it takes you to work through things. I know that my first book that I published with Poetry Publications, I was very, very fortunate that Makosazana Traba had agreed to do an edit for me. And I got her edits and I couldn't even look at them for a full month. And then I looked at them and then I cried for another 2 months. And only after that could I engage, and the engagement took me a year. So I think that that's one of the crucial things about publishing, is that you need to give yourself enough time. People often have deadlines. They want to publish in 6 months or in 4 months or in 2 months. And again, you need to just ask yourself, what do you want to get out of this publishing process? What do you want the book to do? Do you want it to be your personal business card, and it is more about you than about the book? Then that's fine. But then just be aware of what you are putting out into the world and why. The allowing sufficient time for editing engagement, and committing to that process, committing to the painful thing of reading somebody's comment saying, this isn't a poem, or I expected better from you here. I mean, not all editors need to kind of be that, phrase things like that, but like, to be able to get useful editing, you need people who will be honest, and also who can work and see what you're doing with your poetry, see what you're aiming towards. So there's an element of editing that you need to have done before you start taking your manuscript to any kind of team. And then I think this is something that people don't always think about. And I think the ideas about editing and what kind of editing it takes to make a book are circulating much more, especially like in the poetry circles. And I think that this is really good and it's really helpful for the stories that are being put out. But the structuring of your book is also really, really key. So that is something that I struggled with hugely, because the structuring is, what overall narrative are you telling? What is the relationship of the poem on page 2 have to the poem on page 40, and why? Why are they in this order? And do you want it to be a very kind of straightforward order that you go maybe from winter to spring, and that's a logical progression, and that's fine, but that sometimes doesn't do complete justice to the poetry that you have in the book, because the poetry is often much more complicated than like an easy transition through seasons, just as an example. So really considering how you want the book to be read, what impact how you imagine your readers engaging with the poetry, but more than that, how do the poems interact with each other and why, and what is the story that the book holds, as well as the story of the individual poems. So I think that those are two really important things to think about before you start approaching a team. And please feel free to send through questions at any stage on any of this. I'm going to talk for a bit, and then I'm going to interact with some questions with the attendees in the room, and with people watching at home. So what kind of team do you need? This is just kind of reiterating, you need support. It is an emotional and an exciting process. It's sometimes a very draining process. So having a support team is great. Cheerleaders are very nice, but to engage and work with your manuscript, you need a team who will commit to the manuscript with you, so you can all realize it's not about you. It's about the work, it's about the manuscript, and obviously, again, like you're intimately connected to that, but so that you're able to kind of take the plunge in some of the difficult steps. So you will need a team that encompasses editing. This is after you've done your own editing, or maybe the editing with your friends, proofreading, artwork, layout, printing, and then we can talk a little bit about the launch, but the launch is kind of very closely linked to what publishing route you've taken. So each of these aspects has its own specific dynamics, and Vangile and Tanya will look into editing and printing in more detail. So I'm going to go into I'm going to go into a little bit of detail with the other processes involved, although I'm going to speak to editing a little bit. So the other thing that I want to touch on here is, what is the role of a publisher? And you can go different routes with a publisher. You can self-publish without the support of a self-publishing company, or you can go through a traditional publisher, a small publisher, but who follows the kind of traditional processes. And a self-publishing company will assist you with, depending on what the company covers, with some or all of the above processes for a fee. And then once you've engaged in those processes with that publishing company, then the books that you print and publish are yours, and they don't belong to the publisher. In the traditional publishing, which impepho Press falls part of, we absorb the cost. So we absorb the cost, and we will talk about money in a minute as well. We absorb the cost of the printing, which is one of the main costs of producing a book. We absorb the cost of proofreading, of layout, of artwork, and of editing. And then when the book comes out, we have the publishing company has the rights to the book, and you get a percentage, depending on which publishing company you go with. You get a percentage of the profits, or with impepho Press, we give you a percentage of the print run of the books. So one of the things that you should also do before deciding where you want to and how you want to bring your manuscript into the world is just to think about what the role of a publisher is. So a publisher, and with this, you need to research your publisher quite carefully. You will want to look at what kind of work this publisher puts out to see if your work falls in that ambit. You'll want to check if they have an open call, which is a time period when they accept manuscripts, unsolicited manuscripts, to look at to see if they fit within the company's ambit. And you also need to research in terms of what exactly they will do for you and your book. So a traditional publisher is more generally inclined to be responsible for the launch and be responsible as well for the distribution of your books, which is a really, really important aspect. And because getting your books into bookstores is hard. It's harder than you kind of expect. And also kind of making things available online, as well as organizing, the main launch, but also maybe different launches in different places, and maybe organizing and hosting events, depending on the publisher and depending on the agreement. But it's important to keep in mind that it's an ongoing relationship that you'll have with the publisher, that is hopefully generative for you and for your book, and that would last a certain period of years. In the self-publishing, really, really depends. I mean, the companies that I know have done really fabulous things in terms of distribution and launches. But again, it's important for you to research your publisher and to check what would be on you and what would be on the publisher, and if that works for you in terms of the book, and if that works for you in terms of finance. It's also important, I spoke about the process of editing, but it's also really important to have an idea of what the kind of time frame would be if you do enter into agreement with a publisher, because publishers are working on numerous books at any given time. Small publishers often have real restrictions on their time, and so it's not realistic to say, okay, I've got my manuscript, I'm going to get it published, I'm going to get everything done within 1 month. So just keep in mind having a realistic time frame. Then so we've spoken about the editing. For the editing process that you get into when you decide your manuscript is ready to hand over to a team, you should find people or one person or two people, the editing process really depends, to engage with your book as a whole. So if you've had people look at separate poems, that's great. you need somebody to engage with your book as a whole, and they need to pay attention to the structure, the poems as a whole, language, punctuation, form, and spirit of the poem. The title of the poem is a really important part, actually, and needs to do specific work within the poem and the book, and that's also something that's often overlooked. So I'm again not going to speak too much on this because Vangile is going to her workshop is more focused on editing. But the main thing that I want to kind of people to take home from today about editing is just that, like, it's going to be so, and it's okay. Getting negative comments on your poems does not mean you are a bad writer. Getting negative comments on your poems does not mean your book doesn't deserve to be published. Getting negative comments on your poems does not mean your stories are not worthy. It's just part of the process. And the more you commit and like can do whatever self-care you need to get through the difficult periods of criticism, the better your manuscript and your book and your stories are going to be coming out into the world. So proofreading is kind of a sneaky one, because it sounds like it's a very quick and easy job, and it sounds like anybody can do it. But I know from personal experience, having thought that I was going to be a fine proofreader and having done a pretty disastrous job of it, that you need a person, and it's not necessarily somebody who is an official or like a proofreader by trade, but it has to be somebody who is familiar with your work, is familiar with the book, because a proofreader reads for language and grammar, and if you have intentional language and grammar usage or like twisting or like pulling away from conventions in your book, then they need to know and understand that, and also to be able to understand kind of what the poems are doing, so that any tweaks they make can be appropriate for the book. Proofreading is generally proofing for typos, proofing for spelling mistakes, proofing for grammar. But yeah, I mean, like I just said, doing this for poetry is more involved, because you do have to understand what the poem is doing. I'm not a good proofreader because I'm an academic and I am kind of trained to scan things, and I'm trying to untrain myself to do that because it's not helpful in either career. But just you need somebody who has a very good eye for detail, who has a very good eye for language, whatever language your poetry is in. And this person should do several proofreads. It's great to have several people do the proofreading, because our eyes get used to filling in the words that we expect to see, filling in the kind of letters we expect to see. And then it gets to a point where you can't pick up, like, this is why you cannot do your own proofreading. Absolutely not, because you have worked and sat with these poems for so long that you will never pick up the difficulties, I mean the errors in the poems, unless you'll pick them up after the book's published, when you're doing readings. But like in the proofreading process, it's very hard to do your own proofreading. So multiple proofreaders who can have a certain kind of engagement with your work. Even with this, generally, I'm saying generally because I want to say always, but I don't want to commit to that for our books. But there will often be errors. Once the book's published, there will be small things that slipped through everybody's reading, and are there in your published book, and it will break your heart. I remember finding my first error in Seaweed Sky, Vangile finding her first error in undressing in front of the window. It's sore, but hopefully by the second or third print run, there won't be any more, because you'll find them as you go through the book, as you do readings, and you'll fix them for the next print run. So this is another thing that will be determined by your publisher and by financial constraints, either on you or your publisher, is how big the print run is. South Africa also has a tendency to do very small print runs for poetry. And we have been pushing back against that a bit, and other publishing companies as well, as poetry kind of gains more traction and sells more books. So we have had at impepho Press, we do print runs of 500, and we've had to go into second print runs with 3 of our books, which is really great. So the number of print runs, the difficulty around this is it's much more expensive per book to do a print run of 100, but to do a print run of 500, you have to have a significant amount of capital. So that's the kind of balance that you're looking at with that. Okay, so the artwork, this also depends. It's also a relationship between you and your publisher. You might have an idea or have chosen your artwork for your book already, and have a very specific idea about what you want, which is great. It will need to be often tweaked because of what is possible and practical for the print runs. So a cover, an artwork that works best with in a glossy format is going to be more expensive than a cover that works with a matte format, or there are different aspects of there are different kind of polishes you can put on, or overlays you can put on that give different effects. But just be aware that as much as you have a really strong idea of what you want, and you're absolutely entitled to stick with that, do listen to your publisher or the person who is doing the layout for you, which I'll discuss now, because the publisher has done more than one book and has an idea of what kind of layout, what kind of fonts, what kind of colors work and complement each other, and what makes a cover just very busy or can distract from something. So it's important to be open to listening to that conversation. It doesn't mean that you have to give up your idea of what you want your book to look like, but it just does mean that there are constraints on what your book will look like eventually. So then you need a layout person as well, and I'm expecting Tanya to speak more to this, but the layout is something that we often don't think about as poets, and it's really important because we're poets, because our lines need to present on the page in a specific way. We need like the line to split there and not 3 words after, and we need the page break there and not 2 lines after, and that's quite a long and kind of negotiated process as well. And so the layout is the last thing that you do before printing, apart from deciding the paper, which I'm absolutely not going to comment on because that is not my strong point. And once the layout is done, the process will be kind of out of your hands, and that's an exciting and scary time. The moment of unboxing your books is such a beautiful feeling, and you should definitely record that moment of excitement, because it's easy for things to just get like swept under the rug, or for you to forget what that moment of magic is. And that moment of magic is like it's so much more than just your poems. It's your stories. It's your voice in the world that is a physical presence now. It's your voice in this collection of poetry voices in South Africa and internationally. It's also your blood, sweat, and tears. It's your having overcome fears, having overcome ego, having overcome your idea of what your poetry needed to be. So once you've gone through this process, do take the time to just enjoy and celebrate that. I'm going to take a few questions now. So there's one on the chat, but attendees, let me just check people's names. So Vangila is here. Itumeleng, Irina, and Erin, just think about if you have any particular questions that we can insert into the discussion. Okay, so the question is from Batsirai Chigama. That's how can a self-published book be distributed worldwide besides in Ingramspark and Amazon? Yeah, so I mean, this is also something that kind of needs to be considered when you look at what different publishing path you're going to take. And it is a difficult one. Well, like Impepho Press is linked to ABC, African Book Collective, but I think that they only work with publishers. I think that maybe trying to make contact with independent bookshops in different countries and sending physical copies there might be an option. But I mean, if you're looking at self-publishing, are you looking at self-publishing with a self-publishing company or individually? Because if you're looking at self-publishing with a self-publishing company, they are likely to have some international contacts or an idea of how the book could be distributed. Okay. I'm just checking some questions have been sent to me via SMS. Erin, Irina, Itumeleng, do you guys have any questions? Okay, there's some questions in the chat now. If I can't afford a proofreader and an editor, is this a problem? Which one can I sacrifice? How much do editors and proofreaders charge? Yeah, these are very good and important questions. That was the section that I wanted to go on to just now in terms of money. Okay, so how much editors and proofreaders charge really depends. I think that they're both really, really important to the process, but it's possible to find ways around having to pay a lot of money for these processes. It depends somewhat on your kind of relationships with poets or people who could provide these services. But I'm not at all here to kind of promote the asking people to do stuff that is significant amounts of time without paying them. But proofreaders, like I was saying, you can get multiple proofreaders, and that's, you know, if you've got a friend who is an avid reader and who has a sensitivity for language, then getting them to do a proofread, you know, like the more different pairs of eyes on it is helpful. And an editor also should pick up on a lot of the typos, but then their role isn't a proofreader. So I would, it is quite a difficult one, but I would suggest trying to find 2 or 3 friends who you think would do the proofreading well and ask them to help you out. An editor is the kind of longer and more expensive process. Editors, they charge such different rates. I know some people charge 100 Rand a page for editing, but also I think that it's important to get your kind of money's worth. So I think that it's fine to try and have a conversation with somebody that you're looking at editing, asking to edit, and just asking them to engage with your work very briefly, and see if they think that they have something significant, like if they're going to be able to edit it well. Because there's some, there are some people who've approached me to edit and I just don't connect with the work at all. And so rather than accepting their money and giving them back very little editing, it's important to kind of just say, I've just said, like, I'm not the person for this manuscript. So I think that while they're both important processes, probably the money that you can that you have could go towards editing. But again, like, just be careful that it's somebody who engages with your work, who connects with your work, and who will be able to do the editing. Are there distribution avenues for independent authors? Yes. So what's great is in Joburg and Cape Town. I don't know so much about the other towns in South Africa, the other places in South Africa. There are a lot of independent bookstores that are really open to stocking individual independent authors' work. So Book Circle Capital is one, Bridge Books is one. You can go with a distribution agent, but that can also be quite expensive. So I would suggest starting with the independent bookstores. And also these bookstores, I mean, speak to them about doing an event, doing a launch of the book there. And see if that's possible, so that you can get some traction. And that's often really good for the bookstore as well, because you as an author and a poet have a following, and then you're bringing people into the store. So in Cape Town, Clark's and Book Lounge are good options. I think Zara and Midrand is still operating. That would also be a good place. Again, like, it's the kind of national and international distribution. I think especially the international is difficult. And some of the big retail chains are difficult to get into, because they work with either distribution agents or with publishers, and they don't, like, I'm not going to kind of name names, but it's often kind of notoriously hard for independent authors to get into, like, some of the big retail chains. And I think while that's not great, I mean, I think it's fine, because I think that the kind of markets that are created around independent authors, especially in poetry, circulate around events a lot. So kind of making a habit of keeping your books with you, and whenever there's an event, check with the organizer if it's possible, if they have a merchandise store, if it's possible to have your books there. But maybe you can give me a little bit more detail on what kind of distribution you are looking for. Okay. Itumeleng, do you have any self-publishing companies that you can recommend? Yes, I do. I was published through the self-publishing company Poetry Publications, that's run by Flo Wellington Motaung, and she is absolutely fabulous. She's super professional. She's very committed to the work and very committed to the books. I've also had really like exciting distributions of my books from her, from being published with her, some in libraries, some in schools. So I would definitely recommend Poetry Publications. It's Poetry, Poetree, publications, and if you search that either on Facebook or on Google, you'll find her and her webpage. Okay, are there other questions? So I want to ask, we've got another person who joined, Jerome. Hi, and I want to ask all of you watching at home, if you have manuscripts ready, what is the scariest thing? What do you feel is the biggest barrier? Is it money? Because that's definitely an issue, even though like we are really trying to the different kind of avenues in the poetry industry is trying to make like different kinds of publishing available. But are any of you at home or in the webinar scared of particular things about publishing? You know, I was scared about my family's reaction to my second book. And it really held me up for quite a long time, because there were very personal poems about my family in the book, and I couldn't kind of undo them. Once they were printed, it kind of makes it real, and it makes it a conversation that you have to have with your family. So I mean, I think that the emotional journey with your book that I talked about with the editing, it really continues throughout your book's life. So I've got a recommendation for another independent publishing company, book publishing in Africa. Contact book clubs. So if you look for book publishing in Africa on Facebook, and then the contact in that is book clubs, and they can help you with the independent or self-publishing. Interesting question. Okay, Tsepo Percival, is the market conducive for African digital books? This is really interesting. I think that, I mean, the normal questions are kind of, is the market around, is there a market for African poetry books, which I think we've, like, through different people and different initiatives, there definitely is. But the African digital books, I would say that it's definitely a market to explore, because a lot of books, are circulated digitally and are enjoyed and shared digitally by South African poets, even if they're not officially digital books. But again, then that's the money option. But I think it's definitely something to explore. Maybe you can ask Vangile this in her workshop, or Tanya, who is talking about the printing, because I'm not 100% sure about the kind of digital publishing aspect. Yeah, but it's definitely something to explore. Okay, Jerome. Yeah, this is what I wanted to get into. Jerome Kutsia is saying that being rejected is the biggest fear. Yeah, and this is, I mean, the process of writing the poems, having the poems in your heart or in your skin or in your spirit, and having the bravery to write them, and then having the bravery to look at them for long enough to put them into a manuscript, and then having the bravery to go through editing and proofreading processes. And then once the book is out, that kind of culminates in a fear of rejection. So I think that also this is what Vangile always reminds me about, like the importance of a multiplicity of voices, that we have so many voices who are so important and so valid and are important to so many people that we are not aware of, and that there hasn't been space for them. But then with the space for them, I think if you connect to what your book is, to you and to any other, even one other person, you can connect to the work that your book is doing in the world, and that your book is valid, your voice is valid, your story is valid. There will always be people who don't like something. Always. Generally, like it's possible to find a really good review of a book and a really bad review of a book, and you want the book to do the work with the people that you with the people that appreciate the work, with the people who need the work. And so I think that, like, focusing on those aspects is important for overcoming the fear. But also, like, the fear doesn't really go away. I'm still scared every time I perform. I'm still scared every time I do a thing in public. And I mean, I've been sitting on a manuscript because I'm too scared to even to give it to my closest friends to look at. So Vangila's writing, wanting to be a writer and not wanting to be rejected is like wanting to be a boxer and not wanting to be punched. By David Barker. So that's a really nice one. Just because one person company doesn't have room for your story doesn't mean it's not important. Yeah. And remember your why. So yeah. It's just reminding us that rejection is a really, really important, I mean, an unavoidable part of being a writer. Let me just, Itumeleng said, for me, allowing people to read my work is scary. More like I feel unsafe now that people can read what I think about. Yeah, I mean, this also ties into the difficult emotional aspect, but like also to the bravery and the magic that can happen, because it can be hard putting your work, letting your work be read, especially by people close to you. Sometimes it's much easier for strangers to read it or to perform in front of strangers than anyone close to you. But again, like Vangile said, that doesn't mean that your story isn't valid. It doesn't mean that it's not important, and it doesn't mean that people don't need it. And putting your story out there, getting your book published, is part of throwing it out into, so that people can find it and connect to it. And when we talk about the kind of founding of Impepho Press, we speak about the fact that all three of us had our lives saved by poetry, at different times, in different ways. But because we recognize the power of poetry to speak into spaces for people to feel seen and heard and to connect, and the power of poetry that poetry has for healing, then we committed to bringing out more books that do that. And your book has the potential to do that. It's just committing to the work, committing to the process, and being okay with being punched. It's not easy. It's really not easy. But it's just, as long as you take the punch and you get up, and you don't let it derail your idea of your worth or your importance or the importance of your work. So Jeremy is saying they recently sent out 10 submissions. 4 out of 10 were rejected and 2 out of 10 were accepted. Yeah, writing and publishing is a process, and that's my golden tip for the day. Great. So, I mean, that's amazing that you sent out 10 submissions and 2 have been accepted. sometimes sent out 10 submissions and none have been accepted, and it is part of the process. And when you kind of look from a different perspective, when you're not looking at individual poems, when you're looking at the process of putting a whole book, it's less about there being a hard rejection of somebody at the end of the process looking at your book and saying you need to put all these boxes back in your house and never distribute them because your work is rejected. It's about just being able to hold on to your work and your worth, and carry on putting that out into spaces, because then the book exists, the book is there. And I think that that's a really difficult part of it as well. It's just like committing to the idea that, okay, all of these poems that are very personal and powerful and hard are going to exist in the world, in like, I will be able to hold it and I will be able to page through the book. So I mean, I think that process is also something that maybe we don't really look at explicitly during the publishing process. Is that like, and it's a process that can take as much time as the publishing takes, but like that it is something that's draining and scary. And this is why I also said in the beginning, is like, it is important to have a support team as well as a team that's going to get your book to the most honest and kind of where the why of your book is very clear, and where the stories are saying what they need to say. But yeah, having a support team who can just remind you that you're amazing, that your work is amazing, and that we're doing this for a reason. Are there other questions? No questions from people in the chat. Are there any other questions from people watching at home? Please send them through. Otherwise, I'm going to start to wrap up. We started talking about money when we were talking about editing and proofreading, and it was something that I wanted to stress as like something that makes book publishing very still exclusive in South Africa, and where you do have traditional publishing houses that do take on the cost, we are still like nowhere near enough for all of the stories that need to be told. So if money slows your process down, I wouldn't worry about that. It's very difficult, I was thinking about whether we should speak about the money aspect or not, but I think that it is something that's important to be upfront about, because I would love to have a workshop that says like publishing is wonderful and there's all this hard stuff, but once you get through this hard stuff, it's fine, and not mention the very real barrier that money can be. But what I think is important is to do your research about where and how and what you want to do. If you want to do self-publishing that's just guided by you and not by a self-publishing company, then you need to make sure that you do your research into layout, into printing, into the kind of paper that you need, that you have had the editing input, and that like that you have done sufficient work on the book, that it is ready, and it does what it's supposed to do. Because I mean, the editing it's not about polishing work. It's about making sure that the work does what it's supposed to do, that the stories are there and clear and as kind of glowing as possible. So if the money makes your process take a really long time, then that's just part of it, and it doesn't make your work any less valuable or any less exciting or any less worth it. And although I did say that it's complicated to ask people to contribute editing services or proofreading services without offering remuneration, it is also possible to ask. And I mean, some people are able to do it sometimes, and some people will just say no, and that's okay. Again, like if it's people that you have a relationship with in the poetry community, and so it might be worth kind of spending time in poetry communities and making those connections, and all of this kind of strategic planning, as well as part of getting your book from manuscript to printed work. There's a question from Azania Blackish. Imagine I have a collective of essays and poetry, all of them related. I want to publish them. However, the problem is this work I've shared with other people and put out on Tumblr and Instagram. Would you advise drawing these back and publishing a book? So that's also an interesting question about how much new material a book has to have, and what it means for your work if your work has previously been published either officially or unofficially elsewhere. I don't think that it's an issue. I don't think that it's an issue as well, because you're publishing the book. It might be an issue for your publishers if you're going with a publishing company, but I don't foresee it being really an issue. And otherwise, you have the rights to the book, you have the rights to the work that you put out. It does kind of lead to a whole other discussion on sharing work on social media, that can maybe detriment your publishing. I'm like, when we get into that argument, I'm firmly on the side of work does different work on social media than it does in a book, and you'll generally publish it in a very different form to what it ends up being in the book. It does mean that you can't submit work to some journals or magazines because they won't publish things that you've published on social media, and sometimes you're not allowed to perform stuff that you've published on social media, but I don't think that would be an issue at all. Yeah, Vangila's just adding, and maybe this can be the last point to wrap up, to normalize exchanging services. What skills do you have? If you have a relationship with the person you want to ask to be a part of your book process, exchange skills, barter. Yeah, so that's exactly that. That's really good advice. If you have a relationship with people in the poetry community, and you want to ask them for editing or proofreading, think about what you can offer them maybe in exchange. What skills do you have? What are you good at? And then it's kind of an exchange of energy rather than just a one-sided thing, and that can feel much better for both of you, as well as actually being better. Okay. Thank you, everyone. It's 12 o'clock. I think that's the end of my session. But it's been really, really lovely being in the same virtual space with you, those who are online here, and really lovely sharing virtual space with people who are watching on the live.